My name is Evelyn Hart, and I'm 42 years old. My life has always been built on logic, patterns, and the quiet comfort of things that hold. I work as a data analyst, which probably surprises no one. Numbers calm me. Structure calms me. Predictability has never felt like a trap. To me, it has always felt like safety, like care, like love made visible. My husband Daniel used to say that was what he loved most about me. For 14 years, he called me his anchor. That was my role. I provided. I organized. I steadied the ground beneath us so he could drift through different versions of himself without ever fully falling. When he wanted to launch a boutique coffee subscription service, I supported it. When it collapsed after burning through more money than either of us should have been comfortable with, I absorbed the loss and kept us afloat. When he decided 6 months later that his real calling was wellness coaching, then, later, part-time fitness training, I adjusted the rest of our life around his new passions the way I always did. I paid the mortgage. I handled the investments. I managed the insurance. I tracked the bills, the taxes, and the long-term plans. I thought that was partnership. I thought love sometimes looked like one person holding the center while the other searched the horizon. Last Thursday, the man I had spent 14 years stabilizing sat me down in our living room and told me that same center was suffocating him. The room itself was almost offensively beautiful. Daniel had insisted on redecorating it last fall in soft creams, pale woods, and muted stone tones he said would make the space feel lighter. There was an oversized ceramic vase on the console table near the window that had cost more than my first car payment. A decorative beam stretched over the media wall, purely aesthetic, not structural, but apparently essential to the atmosphere. Every inch of that room reflected the life I had financed, and he had curated. He sat across from me on the linen sofa and wouldn't quite meet my eyes. Instead, he kept glancing toward the window, toward his own reflection in the glass, as if he were rehearsing himself in real time. "Evelyn," he said finally, in that low, careful tone people use when they want credit for being gentle, while they do something brutal. "I need some space." I said nothing. Years of working with data teach you one very useful thing. The preamble is rarely for the person receiving the message. It is for the person trying to survive saying it. He folded his hands and exhaled slowly. "I feel like I'm losing myself. I don't even know who I am anymore." Still, I waited. "You're an amazing woman," he said. "You've done so much for us, for me. You're steady and kind, and you always show up, but—" He hesitated, then gave me a sad smile that felt practiced. "You're not fun anymore. We're not fun anymore. Everything is so planned, so careful, so safe. I feel like I can't breathe inside this version of our life." For a second, I just stared at him. Not because I didn't understand the words. I understood them perfectly. That was the problem. I looked around the room he was criticizing me from, the room inside the house I paid for, the house where every polished surface, every expensive design decision, every soft luxury had been made possible by the safe life he suddenly found unbearable. Something inside me didn't shatter. It hardened. Because the truth was, his speech didn't arrive in a vacuum. It landed on top of months of smaller things that had already been gathering shape in my mind. The secretive smiles at his phone. The sudden bursts of laughter at messages he turned away from me before answering. The expensive new workout clothes from boutique brands I knew he would never buy with his own money unless someone was watching. And the way he had started saying Serena's name with a little too much casualness. Serena, his ex-girlfriend, who had apparently resurfaced as a friend. Serena, who had become his new tennis partner at the club 3 months ago. Serena, who according to Daniel, had changed a lot and was now in a really grounded place. Grounded. That was the word he used while he was slowly floating away from the person holding up his life. I studied him then, really studied him. The fresh haircut, the shirt I'd never seen before, the careful scruff, the wedding ring he had stopped wearing consistently over the last 2 weeks because, as he'd joked, metal had started to feel symbolically heavy. At the time, I had let it pass. Sitting there now, I watched all those little points connect with a terrible kind of grace. He was waiting for me to react, to cry, to ask who she was, to promise to be looser, lighter, more spontaneous, to offer him some reset built around earning back a man who was already halfway gone. Instead, I said, "Done." The silence after that was immediate and absolute. His face changed first. Confusion flickered across it, then something sharper. "Done?" he repeated. "You said you want a trial separation," I said evenly. "I'm agreeing." He blinked. "Just like that?" Yes. You're not even going to fight for us? The question almost made me laugh, though there was nothing funny in me. As if I hadn't already been fighting for us for years in invisible ways he had mistaken for duty. As if managing the life we lived, paying for it, carrying it, protecting it, and smoothing it had not already been one long, continuous act of fighting for us. You told me what you want, I said. I heard you. His expression tightened. He shifted forward, visibly unsettled by the fact that I was not playing the role he had prepared for. Evelyn, I think maybe you're reacting from pride right now. I'm trying to be honest. I thought we could have a mature conversation. We are. No, we're not, he said, a little faster now. You're shutting down. I'm not saying this has to be permanent. But that was the first fully honest thing in the room. Not because he meant it. Because permanence was exactly what his body was broadcasting, even while his mouth tried to preserve an escape hatch. He wanted the language of a temporary pause with the freedom of a clean exit. He wanted moral innocence and practical access. He wanted to leave without losing anything. I looked at him and saw, suddenly, not the man I had loved, but the shape of what he had become inside our marriage. Dependent, restless, entitled, and deeply convinced that my steadiness would still be waiting in the exact same form whenever his experiment with freedom stopped feeling glamorous. I understand, I said. You should pack whatever you need. He stared at me for another long second. Then his jaw set with a flash of irritation. Not grief, not regret. Irritation. Fine, he muttered, standing up. Maybe some time apart will help you understand what I'm trying to say. I didn't answer. He went upstairs. I heard drawers opening, closet doors sliding, the muted thud of luggage being dropped on the bed in the guest room before being dragged back into ours. I stayed exactly where I was. For a while, I let myself feel everything all at once. The first thing was anger. Hot, humiliating anger. The kind that makes your fingertips go cold while your chest burns. I wanted to stand up and sweep that absurd ceramic vase right off the console table and watch it explode across the floor. I wanted to rip that fake decorative beam down with my bare hands. I wanted to go upstairs and ask him how long Serena had been back in his life in ways he had not bothered to confess. But under the anger was grief. A heavier thing, a quieter thing. I thought about the man I met at 28, the one who could make me laugh in a grocery checkout line. The one who used to sit cross-legged on the floor of our first apartment, eating cheap noodles out of mismatched bowls and telling me we were building something real. I had loved that version of him without calculation, without defense. I don't know when he started mistaking devotion for confinement. I don't know when I started mistaking overfunctioning for love. Maybe neither change happened all at once. Maybe that is how people leave each other even before they physically go. In tiny permissions, tiny silences, tiny avoided truths. An hour later, he came downstairs with 2 bags and a garment duffel slung over one shoulder. He had changed into a fitted jacket, which told me more than he meant it to. He wasn't going somewhere temporary. He was going somewhere he cared about how he arrived. He paused in the entryway, keys in hand, and looked at me like he was still waiting for the final emotional scene to begin. Maybe in a few weeks we can talk, he said, once emotions settle. I looked up at him from the chair. Maybe, I said. He hesitated. Then he left. The front door clicked shut with such ordinary softness that for a second it felt unreal. No dramatic slam, no shouting, just the sound of a life-changing shape. I sat there a little longer in the silence he had asked for. Then I reached for my phone. I did not call a friend. I did not call him back. I did not search Serena's name, though I wanted to. I searched for the number of a highly recommended family law attorney named Victoria Cross. When her office sent me to voicemail, I left a clear, concise message. My name, my situation, my request for a consultation as soon as possible. She emailed me back 32 minutes later with an appointment for the following morning. That night I barely slept. But by morning, the grief had thinned into something colder and far more useful. Clarity. A separation is not just an emotional event. It is a legal one, a financial one, a logistical one. It has dates, records, and consequences. Daniel had asked for space as though space were a soft and poetic thing. In the real world, space has boundaries. It has paperwork. If he truly wanted another life, I would not stand in the doorway begging him to come back. I would simply make sure he entered that life honestly. Victoria Cross did not look like the kind of woman people underestimated twice. Her office was quiet, minimalist, almost severe. No unnecessary decor, no soft distractions, just clean lines, glass, and the kind of order that suggested everything inside it had already been thought through 10 steps ahead. She listened to me without interrupting. That alone set her apart from most people in my life. I explained everything in a steady voice. Daniel's request for a trial separation, his sudden need for freedom, the months of subtle behavioral shifts, the reappearance of Serena, the way he had already emotionally exited long before he physically walked out the door. When I finished, Victoria folded her hands on the desk and studied me for a moment. "Do you want reconciliation?" she asked, "or protection?" The question landed heavier than anything Daniel had said the night before. Because it was honest, not emotional, not hypothetical, not wrapped in comforting language, just a clean division between two realities. I didn't answer immediately. Some part of me, the part that still remembered who he used to be, hesitated. But that part had already been speaking for years, and it hadn't been listened to. "Protection," I said. She gave a small nod. "Then from this moment forward," she said, her tone calm and precise, "everything you do must be transparent, documented, and defensible. No impulsive decisions, no retaliatory actions. You are not reacting. You are establishing order." That word again, the same thing Daniel had called suffocating. Victoria slid a legal pad toward herself and began outlining the steps as if she were mapping coordinates. "The moment of separation is a legal marker," she continued. "Your finances, your liabilities, your responsibilities, they all need to be clearly defined starting now." I listened carefully. This was the language I understood. Not feelings, not vague promises, but systems. First, you separate your income. You open a new individual account and rewrote your salary. You do not drain existing shared accounts. That can be interpreted badly. You leave a reasonable buffer for transitional use. Second, you disentangle credit. If he has access to any accounts under your name, you remove that access immediately. You assume responsibility for outstanding balances tied to your credit, but you prevent further accumulation. Third, you update your employment records. A change in marital status often affects benefits, including health insurance. Timing matters. She paused, watching to make sure I was following. I was. Every step, every implication. "Documentation is critical," she added. "Dates, times, amounts, communications. If this escalates, and it likely will, you need to be able to show that every action you took was reasonable and legally sound." There it was again. The quiet acknowledgement that this was not going to remain a calm, mutual trial separation. This was going to become something else. "Do not argue with him emotionally," Victoria continued. "Do not explain beyond what is necessary. You are not here to convince him. You are here to protect yourself." I let that settle, because it meant something deeper than legal advice. It meant I had to stop trying to be understood. I had to start acting in reality. By the time I left her office, I didn't feel better. But I felt aligned. There is a difference. The rest of that Friday became execution. Not chaos, not panic. Execution. I opened a new checking account under my name alone. Clean, secure, isolated. Then I logged into my employer's system and redirected my direct deposit. Every future paycheck would land there, untouched by anything connected to Daniel. I didn't empty the joint account. Victoria had been clear about that. Instead, I left a buffer, $4,000. Enough to cover short-term expenses, enough to prove good faith, enough to ensure no one could argue that I had cut him off without warning. Then I transferred the remainder of my personal savings. I recorded the exact time, the exact amount. I even noted the reason: post-separation financial restructuring. Next came the credit card. I was the primary account holder. Daniel was an authorized user. One phone call. That was all it took. "I need to remove an authorized user from my account," I told the representative. They asked for verification. I provided it. They processed the request. "His card will no longer be active," the woman said. "You will remain responsible for the existing balance." I understand. Nearly $8,000. I absorbed it without hesitation. Better to own the liability cleanly than leave it as a loose thread someone else could pull. Then I logged into my company's HR portal. This was the step that sat heavier than the others. Not because it was complicated, because it was irreversible in a way the others were not. I updated my marital status. Separated. The system processed the change immediately. A notification appeared on the screen confirming what that meant in practical terms. Dependent benefits would terminate at the end of the current month. I stared at the date, June 15th. 15 days. That was the remaining window. After that, continuation coverage would be offered, but at full cost. Expensive. Very expensive. I knew exactly how expensive. Because I handled those numbers every year, And I knew something else too. Daniel's migraine medication. He had struggled with it for years. Chronic, severe, debilitating when untreated. The prescription alone, without insurance, cost more than $600 a month. I didn't smile. I didn't feel satisfaction. But I did feel the weight of reality settling into place. He had asked for independence. Independence comes with cost. He came back the next day. Saturday, late morning. The sun was too bright for the mood he carried in with him. He walked in like nothing had fundamentally shifted, like this was an intermission. "Hey," he said casually, dropping his keys into the bowl by the door, as if it still belonged to both of us. "Just grabbing a few more things." I nodded once. "Take what you need." He moved through the house with an ease that would have felt normal 24 hours ago. Opening drawers, pulling shirts from hangers, checking his phone between movements. At one point, he laughed quietly at something on the screen. Not with me, at something else. Someone else. When he came back downstairs, he leaned against the kitchen counter and looked at me with that same faint, almost indulgent smile. "Hope you're not too lonely rattling around in this big place," he said. Lonely. Such an interesting choice of word. As if solitude were worse than being slowly replaced in your own life. "I'm managing," I replied. He picked up his bag. "Oh, and Evelyn," he added, like an afterthought. "Let's not make this complicated, okay? It's just space. We'll figure things out in a few weeks." There it was again. The assumption that everything he was stepping away from would remain perfectly preserved, waiting for him to return and reassess at his convenience. "I've already started the formal process," I said. He blinked. "Process?" "The separation," I said calmly. "Legal and financial. You might want to speak with an attorney." For a second, he just stared at me. Then he laughed. Actually laughed. "Evelyn, come on," he said, shaking his head. "You're being dramatic. This isn't a divorce. It's a break." I held his gaze. "It's a separation," I said. "And it has consequences." He exhaled sharply, clearly irritated now. "Okay, fine. Do whatever you need to do. Just don't turn this into something it doesn't have to be." That was the difference between us. He still thought this was optional. I knew it wasn't, because the moment he walked out that door for someone else, even if he hadn't said her name out loud, it had already become something irreversible. He slung his bag over his shoulder and headed for the door. "Try not to overthink everything," he added, almost as a final jab. The door closed behind him. And for the first time since this began, I allowed myself a small exhale. Not of relief, but of certainty. He had no idea what was already in motion. And I was done explaining it to him. It took 5 days for reality to reach him. 5 days of whatever version of freedom he had imagined. 5 days of curated independence, late mornings, careless laughter, and the illusion that life could be lived without structure because someone else had always quietly maintained it. Then, on Wednesday afternoon, the first crack appeared. My phone lit up with his name. I stared at it for a second before opening the message. "Daniel. Hey, this is weird. My card just got declined at the store. The cashier made it super awkward. Can you call the bank? I think there's something wrong with their system." I read it twice. Not because I didn't understand. Because I did. Completely. There was no anger in his message, no awareness, just mild inconvenience dressed as expectation. I typed my response slowly. "Me. There's no system error. I removed you from the account last week. We're separated, Daniel. Our finances are separate now, too." The typing bubble appeared immediately. Disappeared. Appeared again. Paused. Then, "Daniel, you did what?" "Evelyn, I needed that card. I was literally in the middle of buying something. Why would you do that without talking to me?" I leaned back in my chair, reading the words without emotion. Needed. That word again. As if access to my resources was a basic utility of his life. "Me. I did talk to you. I told you I was starting the formal process. This is part of it. You can use the debit account for now." Silence. A longer silence this time. Long enough that I knew exactly what he was doing. Checking the balance. Calculating. Reframing. The $4,000 I had left there was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Cushioning the fall, just enough that it didn't feel like impact yet, while making it very clear that the ground had changed. His next message came slower. "Daniel, this feels extreme." I didn't reply, because this wasn't about feelings. It was about reality. The real confrontation came Saturday morning, 9:02 a.m. The doorbell rang once, then again longer this time. I already knew it was him. What I didn't expect was that he wouldn't come alone. When I opened the door, Daniel stood there with his mother beside him, Marianne, a woman who had spent 14 years treating me less like a partner and more like a long-term solution to her son's instability. To her, Daniel was not irresponsible. He was creative, not unreliable, but searching. And my role in that narrative had always been simple: support the search, no matter how long it took or what it cost. Her eyes swept over me the moment the door opened. Sharp. Accusing. "Evelyn," she said, stepping inside without waiting to be invited, "we need to talk." Daniel followed her in, already tense, already carrying the weight of something he hadn't been prepared to handle. I closed the door behind them calmly. "What's going on?" I asked, though I already knew. Marianne turned to face me fully. "You canceled his card," she said, her voice firm with righteous indignation. "Are you trying to humiliate him?" There it was. Not concern. Not curiosity. An accusation. "I'm establishing financial boundaries," I said evenly. "That's standard during a separation." Daniel let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Boundaries? This isn't some business contract, Evelyn. This is my life." "Yes," I said, "and you chose to separate it from mine." His jaw tightened. "You're doing this to punish me, because I wanted space, because I was honest with you." Honest. The words sat between us like something fragile and dishonest at the same time. "I'm not punishing you," I replied. "I'm giving you exactly what you asked for." Marianne shook her head, stepping closer as if proximity would give her argument more weight. "This is cruel. He's going through something. He's trying to figure himself out. And you're cutting him off like this? After everything he's been dealing with?" I almost asked her what exactly that was. The burden of being supported? The exhaustion of never having to carry anything alone? But I didn't. Because this conversation wasn't about truth. It was about roles, and I had just stepped out of the one they were used to. "The life he finds so restrictive," I said calmly, looking directly at Daniel now, "is the same life that paid for everything he's been using without thinking." The room went quiet. Not because they agreed. Because they didn't expect me to say it out loud. I let that sit for a moment. Then I continued. "And since we're discussing logistics, there's something else you need to know." Daniel frowned slightly. "What now?" "I updated my employment records," I said, "which means your coverage under my health insurance ends at the end of this month." The words landed differently. He didn't react immediately. Marianne blinked. "What does that mean?" she asked. Daniel's face had already started to change. Not anger. Not yet. Something closer to calculation. "My medication," he said slowly. "Evelyn, my migraine prescription." "Yes," I said. "Without insurance, it's expensive." "How expensive?" Marianne demanded. I met her eyes. "Over $600 a month for the prescription alone, and continuation coverage will likely be close to $900. The silence that followed was no longer tense. It was heavy. Real. Marianne's expression shifted first. "That's insane," she said. "You can't expect him to pay that." I kept my eyes on Daniel. "He'll receive information about continuation coverage in the mail. It will explain his options." "This is unbelievable," Daniel said, his voice rising now. "You're seriously doing this? Over what? Because I said I needed space?" "No," I said quietly, "because you chose to leave." "That's not the same thing." "It is." He stared at me like he didn't recognize me. And in a way, he didn't. Because the version of me he knew would have softened by now. Explained more. Reassured him. Made the consequences feel temporary, negotiable, reversible. This version of me didn't. "You're being cold," he said finally. "No," I replied. "I'm being clear." Marianne stepped in again, her voice sharper now. "This isn't who you are, Evelyn. You're not this kind of person." I almost smiled, because she was right. I wasn't this person before. Before, I was the one who absorbed everything quietly, who kept things running no matter how unbalanced they became, who mistook endurance for love. "I've already retained legal counsel," I said instead. That landed harder than anything else. Daniel's expression froze. "You what?" "I have an attorney. Her name is Victoria Cross. I'd recommend you find one as well." For the first time since he walked in, something like real uncertainty crossed his face. Not annoyance. Not frustration. Uncertainty. "You're serious," he said. "Yes." The room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls had shifted inward around the version of reality he had been trying to maintain. Marianne reached for his arm. "Come on," she said, her voice lower now. "We're leaving." He didn't argue, didn't push, didn't try to regain control of the conversation. He just looked at me one last time, trying to reconcile something, trying to understand how the woman who had quietly held his life together had become someone who could let it fall without stepping in to catch it. Then he turned and walked out. The door closed behind them with more force this time. Not a slam, but not soft either. I stood there for a long moment after they left, listening to the silence settle again. It felt different now. Not empty. Defined. The first impact had landed, and for the first time I knew he felt it. The letter arrived 2 weeks later. It was thick, official, and exactly what Victoria had warned me about. I sat at my kitchen table, sunlight cutting across the surface in long, clean lines, and opened it without hesitation. Daniel's lawyer had chosen a very specific tone: aggressive, emotional, strategically distorted. According to the document, I was a controlling and punitive spouse who had reacted to a temporary emotional request with disproportionate financial aggression. I had, apparently, acted out of bitterness, insecurity, and a desire to force Daniel back into compliance. They claimed he was emotionally vulnerable, that I had exploited that vulnerability by cutting off access to shared resources, and that my actions had created undue hardship. There it was. The narrative. Not truth. Narrative. I read it once, then again more slowly, noting the phrasing, the omissions, the way facts had been rearranged just enough to sound convincing to someone who didn't know better. Then I forwarded it to Victoria. She called me less than an hour later. "Classic," she said. Her voice carried no frustration, no urgency, just quiet recognition. "They're trying to shock you into reacting, make you feel like you've overstepped so you rush to correct it. You haven't." I leaned back in my chair. "They're asking me to reinstate financial support immediately." "Yes," she replied calmly, "and we won't." Simple. Decisive. "What happens next?" I asked. "We respond with facts," she said. "No emotion, no escalation, just documentation." That was the part I was ready for. Because unlike Daniel, I had not been improvising. Every step I had taken had been recorded, dated, justified, and defensible. "We'll establish the timeline," Victoria continued. "His voluntary departure, your immediate legal consultation, the structured financial separation, the maintained buffer, the assumption of shared debt, everything." "And Serena?" I asked quietly. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "That depends. Do you want to prove what you already suspect?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes." "Then we don't rely on suspicion," she said. "We rely on evidence." 3 days later, I hired a private investigator. It was not a dramatic decision. It was a logical one. If this was going to escalate, and it already had, then clarity mattered more than comfort. The investigator worked quickly, quietly, efficiently. It took him 72 hours. When the report arrived, I didn't open it immediately. I sat with it on the table in front of me for a full 10 minutes. Not because I was afraid of what I would find, but because I already knew. The truth, when it has been building slowly for months, rarely surprises you when it finally takes form. It simply confirms what you've been trying not to name. When I finally opened the file, everything inside was exactly as expected. Dates, times, locations, photos. Daniel and Serena entering her apartment building, leaving together the next morning. Multiple nights. Not recent, not post-separation. Before. There was one image in particular that held my attention longer than the others. They were sitting on her balcony in the morning light, coffee cups in their hands, leaning toward each other in a way that was not casual, not ambiguous, not new. Comfortable, familiar, intimate. I closed the file. Not slowly, not dramatically, just decisively. Because that was the moment the last uncertainty disappeared. This wasn't a man searching for himself. This was a man who had already found something else and wanted to keep both. Victoria's response took 4 days to draft. 4 days of precision, careful language, and building something that didn't just argue, but dismantled. When she sent it to me for review, I read it with the same calm I had read everything else. It was quiet. That was the most devastating thing about it. No accusations. No emotional language. Just a structured sequence of facts. Daniel had voluntarily left the marital residence. I had sought legal counsel immediately. All financial adjustments had been made post-separation. A reasonable monetary buffer had been left accessible. Outstanding shared debt had been assumed solely by me. Every claim in his lawyer's letter was addressed. Not aggressively, but completely. And then came the shift. The part that turned defense into offense. We attached the investigator's report. Every image, every timestamp, every documented instance of his relationship with Serena. We formally stated that Daniel had entered into an ongoing romantic relationship prior to the separation, that this relationship constituted a breach of trust, and more importantly, that shared marital resources had likely been used to support it. Victoria didn't stop there. She added a motion, a precise, targeted one. We filed for discovery on the basis of dissipation of marital assets. We requested access to Daniel's financial records. And Serena's. That was the moment the situation changed. Because until then, Serena had existed outside the consequences. She was the fantasy, the escape, the person Daniel could move toward without cost. Now she was part of the case, and cost was coming. The reaction was faster than I expected. Not from Daniel, from her. 3 days after the response was delivered, my phone rang from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something told me to. Hello? There was a pause. Then a voice, smaller than I expected, unsteady. Evelyn, she said. Serena. I didn't speak. I think there's been a misunderstanding, she rushed out. I didn't know. Daniel told me you two were basically over, that it was just paperwork at this point. Her voice trembled. Not with guilt. With fear. I see, I said. That report. Your lawyer. She's dragging me into this, Serena continued, her words speeding up. I'm not part of your relationship. I don't want to be involved in any legal situation. I leaned back in my chair, calm, measured. You became involved when you accepted things that weren't yours, I said. Silence. She started, then stopped. I didn't know about the money? Then you won't have any issue clarifying that under oath, I replied. Another pause. Longer this time. Heavier. You don't understand, she said finally, her voice dropping. This could ruin me. I almost asked her what she thought she had been building, but I didn't. Because this wasn't about educating her. It was about reality. My finances were used to support your relationship, I said evenly. That makes you relevant. She inhaled sharply. I didn't ask for any of this, she whispered. No, I said, but you participated in it. The line went quiet. Then, this is insane, she said, but the conviction wasn't there anymore. I just wanted... She stopped herself. Whatever she had wanted no longer mattered, because what she had stepped into was no longer a private arrangement. It was a documented sequence of decisions with consequences. You should speak with a lawyer, I said. Then I hung up. That night, Daniel called. I didn't answer. He called again. And again. Then came the messages. First defensive, then angry, then something closer to panic. You had someone follow me? Are you serious right now? This is insane, Evelyn. You've gone too far. I read them all. I didn't respond, because there was nothing left to explain. The truth was no longer something I carried quietly. It was something that had been placed into a system that would process it slowly, relentlessly, and without emotion. For the first time since this began, I could feel the shift completely. Not just in him, not just in her, but in the structure of everything around us. The illusion had broken, and what was left was consequence. The calls started the next morning, not just from Daniel, from his mother, from unknown numbers, from blocked IDs. At first, they came in bursts. 3, 4, 5 calls within minutes of each other. Like urgency alone could force me to respond. When I didn't pick up, the voicemails began. I listened to the first one. That was enough to understand the pattern. Marianne's voice came through sharp and shaking, a mixture of outrage and something that sounded almost like disbelief. Evelyn, this has gone far enough, she said. You've made your point. Now you need to stop this before it gets out of control. Stop! As if I had started something impulsively. As if this hadn't been a direct response to a decision her son made with full intention. The next message was Daniel. His voice was tighter than I had ever heard it. What are you doing? He demanded. You've dragged Serena into this. You've hired someone to follow me. Do you even hear yourself right now? There was a pause, then quieter. This isn't who you are. I almost deleted the message without finishing it, but I let it play, because I wanted to hear exactly how far his understanding had shifted, or hadn't. You're trying to destroy my life over a misunderstanding, he continued. We were already separating. You said it yourself. This is just vindictive. Vindictive. I replayed that word once in my mind. Then I set the phone down. Because the truth was, none of this was about emotion anymore, and he was still trying to drag it back there. Victoria called me later that afternoon. They're reacting exactly as expected, she said. Serena contacted me, I replied. I'm not surprised. She's scared. Yes, Victoria said calmly, because she didn't anticipate consequence. That was the pattern, wasn't it? None of them had. Not Daniel, not Marianne, not Serena. They had all operated under the same assumption, that I would absorb whatever happened quietly, rationalize it, and continue maintaining the system they benefited from. Now that the system had changed, they didn't understand it. They'll try to pressure you, Victoria continued, emotionally, socially, whatever they can use. It's important that you don't engage outside of documented communication. I haven't responded. Good. Let them exhaust themselves. We move forward with facts. A week later, the pressure shifted, from noise to fracture. Serena was the first to break. Victoria received the call from her lawyer. Not a demand. An offer. He wants to cooperate, Victoria told me that evening. Daniel? I asked. No, she said. Serena. I didn't speak for a moment, because that made sense. People like Serena, people who enter situations believing they are stepping into something exciting, elevated, and somehow just beyond consequence, rarely stay when reality turns heavy. What does cooperation look like? I asked. A full statement, affidavit, timeline, financial acknowledgement. In exchange, we remove her from further proceedings. There it was. Self-preservation. Clear. Immediate. Predictable. And Daniel? He's losing control of the narrative, she replied, which means he's losing leverage. For years, Daniel had leverage without realizing it. My patience. My stability. My willingness to carry more than my share. Now that balance had shifted. The affidavit arrived 3 days later. I read it alone at the same kitchen table where I had opened his lawyer's letter. The tone was different. Not aggressive. Not defensive. Just careful. Serena detailed everything. When they reconnected. How often they met. When the relationship shifted from friendly to something else. And most importantly, when it started. Months before he asked for space. Months before he told me he was losing himself. Months before he sat in that carefully curated living room and framed his betrayal as a personal awakening. There were financial details too. Dinners, trips, gifts, all tied back in one way or another to shared resources. To money I had earned. Money I had managed. Money I had believed was supporting a life we were building together. I didn't cry. I didn't feel shocked. I just understood. Fully. Finally. Because this wasn't about one decision. It was about a pattern, a slow erosion of truth that had reached its natural conclusion. Daniel called again that night. This time I answered. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to hear what was left. His voice was different, lower, less certain. Evelyn, he said. No accusation. No anger. Just strain. I think we need to talk, he added. I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence stretch. Then, there's nothing to talk about, I said. There is, he insisted quickly. This has gone too far. We can fix this. We just need to... Fix what? I asked. He stopped, and in that pause I could hear it. The absence. He didn't have a clear answer. Because what he was asking for wasn't resolution. It was reversal. He wanted to go back to a version of reality where his choices hadn't fully materialized, where consequences were still negotiable, where I was still willing to bend. You're blowing this out of proportion, he tried again, but the confidence was gone now. It didn't have to be like this. You're right, I said quietly. There was a flicker of relief in his voice. Exactly, so if we just... It didn't, I continued, until you made it this. Silence. Heavy. Final. I didn't think you'd do all this, he admitted. And there it was. The truth. Not about what he did, but about what he expected. You didn't think I would stop you, I said. He didn't answer. Because he couldn't. You thought you could step outside of this marriage and still rely on it when you needed to. That's not fair, he said weakly. It's accurate, I replied. Another silence. Then... What happens now? He asked. Not demanding. Not arguing. Just asking. I looked out the window as I answered. Now everything continues exactly as it is. I hung up before he could respond. After that, the calls slowed. The messages stopped. Not completely, but enough. Because the situation had shifted beyond emotion, persuasion, and negotiation. It was no longer about who felt what, or who wanted what. It was about what could be proven, documented, and decided without either of us standing in the same room. For the first time since this began, the noise faded. And in its place was something else. Not relief. Not yet. But something quieter. Stronger. The sense that the outcome was no longer uncertain. It was just unfolding. It didn't end in a courtroom. No dramatic cross-examinations. No final speeches. No moment where someone stood up and declared victory. It ended quietly, which, in a way, made it more definitive. 8 months after Daniel walked out of that house, the process concluded in a conference room with neutral walls, a long table, and 2 attorneys who had already done all the real work long before we sat down. By then, there was nothing left to argue, because the legal process had done what it was designed to do. It had taken everything emotional, everything distorted, everything framed as opinion, and reduced it to fact. Serena's affidavit had been the turning point, not because it was dramatic, but because it was complete. Dates, messages, financial overlaps, confirmations of timing that erased any ambiguity about when their relationship had actually begun. It dismantled Daniel's version of events with a precision no argument could compete with. And once that happened, everything else followed. His lawyer stopped pushing. The tone of their communication shifted from aggressive to practical. Settlement, terms, closure. The house was sold. That part was simple. It had always been our primary marital asset, and the law treated it accordingly. The equity was split evenly. Clean, efficient, final. My portion was enough to secure a down payment on a smaller place. Not as large, not as curated, but entirely mine. Daniel's portion came to him as a single payout. A final transfer. The last time anything I had built would directly support his life. Spousal support became his final point of resistance. He tried, not aggressively, not confidently, but persistently. He argued that the separation had disrupted his ability to stabilize, that he needed time to rebuild, that the lifestyle we had shared should be considered in determining ongoing support. But the facts were already in place. The timeline, the infidelity, the financial dissipation, the documented use of shared marital resources to support a relationship that had existed long before he asked for space. It all worked against him. In the end, the court granted him minimal rehabilitative support. 2 years, a controlled amount. Enough to transition, not enough to maintain the life he had walked away from. The difference mattered, because for the first time in his adult life, he would have to sustain himself without leaning on something he didn't build. The financial recovery came next. That was the part Victoria had been most precise about. The dissipation claim. Every dollar that had been traced, every dinner, every trip, every expense connected to Serena was calculated and deducted from his share of the house equity. $15,000. That was the number. $15,000 that had quietly left our shared life and been redirected into something he thought existed outside consequence. It didn't, and in the end, he paid it back. Not symbolically, not emotionally, literally. The system corrected itself. After that, there was nothing left to divide. No more arguments, no more letters, no more calls, just paperwork, signatures, completion. I heard things afterward, not directly, but through the kind of distant channels that carry information without invitation. Daniel rented an apartment, small, functional, temporary in a way that felt less like choice and more like necessity. He found full-time work, not in something he was passionate about, not in something he described as meaningful. Just work, the kind that pays bills, the kind that requires consistency. Serena didn't stay. Of course she didn't. According to what I heard, she left the moment the legal pressure intensified, the moment the relationship required something more than secrecy and excitement, which made sense, because what they had built together had never been designed to survive reality. Marianne, meanwhile, had her son back, in a way, but not in the version she had always defended. Not the one who could drift freely while someone else absorbed the impact. Now she had a son who needed support, financial, emotional, practical. The dynamic had shifted, and there was no one left to carry it for them. As for me, the first few months after everything finalized were quieter than I expected. Not peaceful, not immediately, just quiet. There's a difference between ending something and processing it. For a long time, my life had been structured around maintaining a system that no longer existed. When that system disappeared, it left behind space. And space, at first, can feel like absence. I started therapy, not because I was falling apart, but because I wanted to understand how I had stayed in something that had been slowly unraveling long before it broke. We didn't talk much about Daniel. Not directly. We talked about patterns, about tolerance, about the difference between supporting someone and carrying them, about the way consistency can sometimes hide imbalance. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. My new place is smaller. A condo. Simple. Functional. Quiet in a way the house never was. There are no decorative beams, no oversized statements, no curated illusions. Just space that reflects exactly what it is. Mine. I kept very little from the old house. Some books. My chair. A few pieces that felt like they belonged to me, and not the life I had been maintaining. Everything else stayed behind, or was sold, or was simply let go. There's a coffee machine on my kitchen counter now. Overly complex. German. The kind of thing Daniel would have laughed at and called unnecessary. It makes a perfect cup every morning. Precise. Consistent. Reliable. I like that. I've started hiking on weekends. Nothing extreme. Just long walks through quiet trails where the only sound is wind moving through trees, and my own footsteps settling into a rhythm that doesn't depend on anyone else. The first time I reached the top of a ridge and looked out over the valley below, I didn't feel excitement. I didn't feel adrenaline. I felt something else. Something deeper. Something steadier. Peace. It surprised me, because for a long time I thought peace was just the absence of conflict. But it isn't. It's the presence of alignment, of knowing that the life you're living matches the truth you're standing in. Daniel once told me I wasn't fun anymore, that I had become too structured, too predictable, too safe. He thought freedom meant breaking away from that, from me, from everything I represented. But standing there, alone, looking out over that valley, I understood something he never did. Freedom isn't chaos. It isn't escape. It isn't chasing something new because you've grown bored of what's stable. Freedom is not having to hold together something that only works because you refuse to let it fall apart. Freedom is not carrying someone who calls your strength a cage. The rock doesn't need to become lighter. It doesn't need to become more exciting. It just needs to stop being something someone else stands on while they look for somewhere better. Now, it stands on its own.